part 2 of our lesson 9 of our PMP certification training. Once again, my name is Obalim and I'm going to be your anchor person. So in this part 2, remember we're under project communications management, and we said that in part 2 we shall be taking a look at the ITTOs, that's the input, tools and techniques and output for the processes that we have under project communications management. So we said that there are 3 processes under project communications management, and those 3 processes are: first you plan communications, then you manage communications, and then you monitor communications. So taking a look at each of these processes one after the other, let's talk about the plan communications process. So the plan communications management is the process of developing an appropriate approach and plan for project communications based on the information needs of each stakeholder or group, available organizational asset, and the needs of the project. So the plan communications management process considers how to develop a plan for project communication activities. So this belongs to the planning process group. So this is basically where we talk about how we will be able to reach our stakeholders and carry out our project information, the frequency of the information, their preferred needs of information, and then who will be responsible for sending such information. That's part of what we do during the plan communications process. So why is this necessary? Notice that this is necessary. Always look at it from the perspective that you have a very large scale project that involves a series of organizations across board and then across different organizations. And then also, people from different industries as well as countries. So you don't share the same, say for example, language. You also don't share the same time zone, and then also some other similarities. So because of that, you need to be able to speak with that guy, say in China, for example. You need to be able to determine when is the best time to reach the Chinese, then also what language, and then how can you translate, and then what medium. So that's part of the things you do during the plan communication. That's where you clearly figure out all of these things in your communications plan to enable you to determine effectively how to communicate with your team members. So of course the input would include your charter, which of course also has an element of project communications, and then also your project management plan. Because this is where we're going to be sending in the communications management plan, which we're going to be creating. And far from that, there are also other components of the project management plan that might be of interest to us. For example, our stakeholder register, our stakeholder management plan. All of these are some of the documents within the project management plan that will enable us to also plan our communications. Then also other project documents, for example, your resources, your team members, your RESI metrics, your stakeholder register. All of these are part of the inputs you need when you're planning your communications. Then you also want to determine if there is maybe a communications management plan that's been created in this organization before that can be a reference point for this communications management plan that you want to create, as well as putting into consideration other factors that are external that can also affect the creation of the communications management plan. So part of the techniques that we use in creating the communications management plan would include expert judgment. So as usual, this is the opinion of a subject matter expert. So sometimes you will need expert judgment because this would enable you to effectively, plan your communications. Then your communication requirement analysis. So your communication requirement analysis would help you to be able to determine the number of communication channels to create. And then, like I mentioned earlier on, how each one can reach one within your team. Then also your communication technology, because when you're planning your communication, you need to also put into consideration which communication technology would be adopted. You don't want a situation where you come up with a communication technology that your team members don't have access to, for example, or they don't know how to use such communication technology. So this is also part of the things you put into consideration. Then your communication models. Of course, communication models here now talk about how we encode as well as decode our project information. Then also our communication method, which includes the formal written, the formal verbal, the informal written, as well as the informal verbal communications. You also need your interpersonal skills as part of the tools and techniques when you're planning your communications, because for you to effectively communicate, interpersonal skill would actually be required. Then also data representation skills. So data representation will help you to effectively represent your data, as well as meetings. Meetings is where you come together to brainstorm to determine the best and most effective way to communicate with our team members as well as stakeholders within the project. So the output will be the communications management plan, which is basically a plan as to how to carry out your communications. And then of course, you now update your project management plan, because this communication management plan will now be added to the project management plan. And then also other documents may be updated by virtue of the plan communications process, because we may notice that we need specific communication technology to adopt. Say for example, an ERP system that will enable us to effectively communicate within our team. And then if that's the case, we now need to go back and update specific project documents in order to capture this new requirement. So let's refer to our student workbook. You're going to see a template for the communications plan. So you're asked to develop your communications plan for the new tax mobile app you are working on. So use two of the stakeholders you identified for this particular plan. If you notice, when we started this particular training, in the very first, when we're discussing introduction to project management, we had a particular lesson there that talks about stakeholder identification. We had a particular task there that asks us to identify our stakeholders. So you can take a look at your stakeholder list and then see if you can use two of the stakeholders you've earlier identified to create this communications management plan. Okay, good. So after you plan your communications, then the next thing is to manage communication. Look at the manage communication more like executing what you have in the communications management plan. So please, if you did not do the last task, I suggest you do it, because it will give you a better idea of what we're talking about. So this is basically an executing process. And that's why we said that manage communication is a process of ensuring timely and appropriate collection, creation, distribution, storage, retrieval, management, monitoring, and the ultimate disposition of project information. So this belongs to the executing process group. So part of the input to manage communications would include our project management plan, then also our project documents, our work performance reports, organizational process assets, as well as the enterprise environmental factors. So these are some of the inputs we need to manage communications. And then of course, don't forget that the project management plan is already, don't forget that the communications management plan is already within our project management plan. So we need it now that we're about to manage our communications. Then also other project documents. For example, you need your stakeholder list. You also need, a list of your vendors, as well as other project documents that may assist you here. Then work performance reports, because this will clearly make up part of the information that you're going to be communicating. And then also organizational process assets. Say for example, you have fax, telephone, an email system within the organization. So all of these are now things of value that can aid you to carry out this very process. Then also enterprise environmental factors. These are factors that are not within your control. You need to put that into consideration. For example, security of the information. All of these are part of the things that you now need to put into consideration when you're managing your communications. So part of the techniques would include our communication technology. So here you're looking at your phones, you're looking at your fax, your email, you're taking a look at your messaging softwares. Then also our communication methods, which we talked about earlier on. Then of course, we'll also take a look at our communication skills. Communication skills is going to be a very important aspect of the managed communications, because you need it to effectively carry out your communication. Then your project management information system, which serves as the repository for your project information. And then also you talk about project reporting. So project reporting here basically talks about all the reports that you've created for your project, especially depicting the status of your project. Then also you have your interpersonal skills. Interpersonal skills is also a technique for managing communications. Especially, you're going to be needing it during the conduct of your meetings, because this will help you to effectively be able to carry out meetings within the project, and then also ensure that information is disseminated in such a way as to not to harm or cause any kind of damage to team or stakeholders. So the output we get after we manage communications will be our project communications. So project communication simply refers to all of those reports, status updates that we do and we have sent out. And then also your project management plan may be updated, including other relevant documents, as well as your organizational process assets, with some of our findings in the course of managing our communications. So let's take a look at this business scenario and you tell me what you make out of it. Communication is 90% of a project manager's job. Communicating status is a critical part of ensuring project success. Your company is a key supplier for a major airline company. Most projects are 1 to 3 years long. A large 18-month design and manufacturing project is about halfway complete when the original project manager leaves for another position and you're asked to step in as the new project manager. The project includes work performed by subcontractors and they have some key deliverables coming up. You need to understand the status of these deliverables. How should you prepare yourself for the project manager role, especially as it relates to communication requirements? So let's see what you can actually make out of this problem statement. So typically you may want to review previous project documents and then also hold a meeting with your team members and then also be able to determine the number of stakeholders you have within the project so that you can create your communication channels, clearly determine the best way to be able to communicate, and then also look at your communications management plan, see if it is workable and see if there are things you can do to update it so that you'll be able to carry out your project communication effectively. So the final process under communications is now the monitor communications process. Of course, notice that you plan, where you created the plan of how you're going to carry out your project communication. You talked about your stakeholders, the information you'll be sending to them, and then what will be the frequency and who will be responsible for that. Then you now manage your communication. So manage communications was where you now began to act on all of those elements. And then you now monitor your communication. So during the monitor communication, this is basically a check-in process. You want to determine if the communications or information you're sending is giving you the desired result. So that's why we said that this is the process of ensuring the information needs of the project and its stakeholders are met. And it's part of the monitoring and controlling process group. Of course, you need the project management plan. That's the communications management plan aspect of the project management plan to monitor your communication, because that will serve as the baseline for you to be able to check the effectiveness of your project communications. Then also other project documents, for example, your stakeholder register, maps, list, and personas. And then also your work performance data, which are part of the things you gather to determine the effectiveness of your communication. Then don't also forget our enterprise environmental factors, which are factors that are not within our control, as well as the organizational process assets. Then part of the tools and techniques would include expert judgment. So we need an opinion of a subject matter expert to enable us to effectively monitor our communications. Then also you might need a PMIS, which of course refers to Project Management Information System. This is your repository where you effectively manage your project information. Then also you do data analysis, comparing your planned communications against the actual, what is happening. And that's part of the things you do during the data analysis. You also need interpersonal and team skills, as well as meetings to enable you effectively monitor your communications. So the output you will get to be your work performance information. Work performance information here refers to specific set of information which of course you're going to be communicating to your team members based on the outcome of your check-in processes. And then this can lead you to do a change request that might now require you to update your communications plan, as well as other documents that will enable us to consistently build an increase in being able to determine, in being able to successfully meet the stakeholders' expectations with regards to communications. So let's take a look at this particular problem statement. Regina is managing a 4-year international project and she is a year and a half into the project. Her project team includes team members from 3 different countries. Because of the distance between team members, many of them have never worked together on a project before. Therefore, Regina has to work hard to map out suitable communication methods in her plan to reach everyone. As the team nears the halfway mark on the project, Regina notices an influx in her issue log and a decrease in her team's productivity and engagement during project team meetings. What are some things Regina can do to motivate her team? Of course, notice that one of the key things that is giving rise to this kind of scenario is because of the fact that, one, the team members are in various or in different countries, and then of course they've never worked together on a project before, and distance is also a major challenge, as it were. So because of that, one key thing Regina can do can be, one, developing a team building activity so that team members can collaborate, be familiar, and then familiarize themselves with one another, and then also clearly determining if there are language bridges or gaps that can actually be worked on. Maybe you now need to bring in translators either via specific softwares or to enable you to reduce that particular noise or distraction or detraction in your communication. And then also there's also a need for you to train your team on the importance of communication and have a well thought out communications management plan. So in this particular lesson, we took a look at project communications management, and under communications, we said that we have what we refer to as 3 processes. So the 3 processes we have in communications are planned communications, where we determine how we are going to go about our communications management. Then we have the managed communications, where we carried out our communications, and then you now have the monitor communications, where we now checked to determine the effectiveness of our project communications. This is basically what we do with regard to communications management. I hope this particular lesson has been very informative for you. Once again, thank you for listening and see you in the next lesson.